The creek came down brown that autumn, and at first she thought it was only the season turning the water to tea color, the way high mountain runoff sometimes did after a hard rain. She stood at the edge of the claim with her apron still dusty from the morning's bread, watching the current slide past in a color that did not belong to any rain she knew, and something in her chest went tight and watchful, the way it used to when a fever came into the ward before anyone could name it. He came down from the timberline an hour later, an axe over his shoulder and sawdust in his collar, and he stood beside her a long while without speaking because there was nothing yet to say. The pool below the claim, the deep bend where the trout used to hold in the shadow of the bank, had gone the color of strong coffee, and the smell rising off it was sharp and bitter, like a wound gone bad. They had proved up the claim 2 years before, a narrow strip of bottomland along the creek, with timber on the slopes, and grass enough for a milk cow and a garden that had, until that summer, given them potatoes and turnips and a stubborn patch of corn that never quite ripened before frost. It was not much of a place by the standards of the valley men who ran cattle on wider ground, but it was theirs, paid for in labor and patience, and the creek had been the heart of it. Clear water, cold enough to ache the teeth, full of trout that rose to anything that touched the surface on a summer evening. Upstream, a mile and more through the timber, the lumber camp had gone up that spring, sudden as a fever itself, with its steam whistle calling men to work before light, and its great piles of peeled bark growing along the bank like something shed by an animal too large to imagine. She had heard the axes for months, had grown used to the distant crash of falling spruce and hemlock, had even found a kind of comfort in the sound of men working, of a country filling in around them. She had not thought, until she stood there with the brown water sliding past her boots, of where all that stripped bark might go once the camp had no more use for it. Josiah crouched at the bank and dipped his hand into the current, lifting a palmful of water that ran through his fingers dark and slow, leaving behind a residue like steeped tea leaves. He did not say what she already knew, that no trout could live long in water like that the garden's irrigation ditch drew from that same pool, that whatever was coming down from the camp above was not going to stop on its own. She looked at the ruined water a long moment, and some old instinct from her nursing days stirred beneath her worry, though she could not yet say what it wanted to tell her. She straightened and walked the bank a little further, following the pale drift of bark shavings where they had caught against a fallen alder, and there she found the water almost still, thickened with a scum the color of strong coffee left too long on a stove. A dead trout lay belly up in the shallows, its gills clogged with fine brown fiber, and she crouched to look at it the way she had once looked at a wound she did not yet understand, turning it over in her mind before she turned it over with her hands. She did not touch the fish. She only studied it, the way the bark dust had settled into every crease of it, and thought of the miners she had nursed years before, men whose gums had gone soft and bleeding from months of salt pork and biscuit with no green thing to balance it, men who had chewed on strips of hemlock bark because someone's grandmother back east had said it would help, and it had, though none of them, and not even the camp doctor, had ever said why. She carried that thought back to the cabin slowly, the way a woman carries a coal in a covered pan across a windy yard, careful not to let it die before she reached the fire. Josiah was already at the boom site when she found him again, pacing the narrows where the creek pinched between two granite shoulders, and she told him, not all at once but in pieces, what she remembered. The bitter tea the older women had brewed from bark and root, the way it darkened a wound and seemed to close it faster, the way sailors and miners alike had sworn by chewing spruce twigs when their teeth grew loose. He listened the way he always did, without hurrying her, his eyes on the water rather than on her face, And when she finished, he said only that a thing which fouled a creek might yet be put to some more honest use, if a body could catch it, before it settled into ruin. They did not speak of it as a plan that first evening, only as a possibility turned over between them like a stone worth keeping, and Hattie found herself watching the drifting bark differently after that. Not as waste, but as something raw and unspent, the way she had once looked at herbs strung to dry in the mining hospital's rafters before she knew their names. Josiah began pacing off the narrows in earnest the next morning, measuring with his eye where 2 stout logs might be chained across the current, and Hattie carried a jar of the brown water back to the cabin, setting it on the sill where the low autumn light passed through it, dark and steeping, as if the creek itself were already trying to tell them what it might become. The frost came thin that week, silvering the grass each morning and burning off by midday, and he used the mild hours to walk the narrows again and again until he knew the bank the way he knew the inside of his own barn. He chose a place where 2 boulders pinched the creek near a bend, the current already slowed by their bulk, and he judged that logs chained between them would hold against the drift without needing to fight the whole weight of the water. He felled 2 spruce near the claim line, trees the lumber camp had not wanted for their crookedness, and he was glad of a use for wood that would otherwise have stood as waste itself. Dragging them down to the water took the better part of 2 days, the ox leaning hard into the traces, mud sucking at its hooves, and more than once he stopped to loosen a chain and let the animal blow before starting again. She came down in the afternoons with cold coffee and stood watching the way the logs settled into the current, murky water folding around them, bark chips already beginning to gather against the wood like leaves against a fence. By the 3rd morning the boom was set, chained fast at both ends, and they stood together on the bank to see what it would do. The creek, so used to carrying its ruin downstream unhindered, pushed against the new barrier and began, almost at once, to give up what it carried. Bark curled and drifted and caught, first in loose scraps, then in slow-turning rafts that thickened as the morning went on, until a brown tangle lay pressed against the logs, like a curd forming on the top of scalded milk. She crouched at the edge and lifted a piece free with a stick, turning it in the light, its underside pale where it had not blackened in the water, still faintly sharp-smelling, still holding whatever bitterness it had carried down from the peeled trunks above the camp. Below the boom, for the first time in weeks, the water ran a shade lighter, not clear, not yet, but no longer choked, and a single trout rose in the shallows as if testing whether the change could be trusted. That evening they sat late at the table, the jar from the sill between them, and began speaking not of whether the bark could be used, but of how, whether it wanted soaking before boiling, how long a fire ought to burn under it, whether the liquor would hold its strength in glass or turn to something spoiled and useless by spring. Neither of them had boiled bark before, only watched others fumble at similar work in other places, and the not knowing sat between them not as a discouragement, but as an invitation, the way an unbroken field looks to a man who has only ever farmed worked ground. Outside, the boom held through the night, gathering what the creek no longer wanted, and upstream the camp went on peeling its trees, unaware yet of what was beginning to take shape below it. The frost came heavy that week, whitening the grass along the bank before sunrise and burning off by mid-morning, and it was in that between hour, neither night nor day, that they built the first rack. He had cut cedar poles the length of his arm and split them into slats, and she had watched the way water moved through the willow baskets the miners' wives once used to strain wash, and between the two notions, the rack took shape. A stepped frame of 4 shallow trays, each tilted to drain into the one below, set on legs driven into the gravel, where the bank shelved toward the pool. It was crude work, lashed with wet rawhide that would tighten as it dried, but it held, and when they laid the first soaked bark along the top tray and let the water find its way downward, tray to tray, the runoff came away darker each time, until what dripped from the last board into the waiting pail looked near black, thick as molasses left too long on the stove. She would not boil it that first day. She said a thing rushed was a thing wasted, and that the miners she had nursed always fared worse under a doctor too eager to be finished. So they let it stand, covered with a scrap of oiled canvas against the frost, and turned instead to hauling more bark from the boom, wading the shallows in boots gone stiff with cold, gathering what had drifted and snagged against the logs like something the creek itself was trying to be rid of. The work numbed their hands and reddened their faces, but there was a rhythm to it that pleased them both, the lift, the carry, the stack, and once, wringing water from her sleeve, she laughed at the sight of him crowned in bark shavings like some woodland creature dressed for a joke no one else would understand. And he laughed too, and for a moment the creek's trouble seemed smaller than it had any right to. By the second evening the collected liquor had darkened further, and she dipped a finger to taste it, careful, the way she'd once tested broth for fevered men who could stomach little. The bitterness struck sharp and lingering, astringent enough to pucker the tongue, and she pronounced it strong, perhaps too strong to drink plain, but perhaps exactly strong enough for what it was meant to do. That night they built the first small fire beneath the black kettle set on stones near the rack, more trial than true production, watching the liquor thicken as it simmered, stirring slow with a peeled stick, neither of them certain yet what point marked done and what point marked ruined. The kettle hissed low into the dark, and above them the frost held off a little longer, as if the night itself had paused to watch what they were making. The kettle taught them patience before it taught them anything else. By the third night she had learned to judge the liquor not by time, but by the way it clung to the stick, thin and quick to drip at first, then slower, then finally trailing off in a dark ribbon that held its shape a moment before falling. That was the point, she decided, where the water had given up all it meant to give, where boiling further would only scorch what patience had already drawn out clean. He watched her make these judgments with a kind of quiet trust that surprised her still, after all their years together, that a man so certain in his own labor would defer so easily to what she carried from another life, another kind of nursing in another place. They worked in shifts now, one tending the fire while the other slept in short snatches by the rack, waking to the smell of char if the flame licked too high, or to silence if it guttered low. The nights were growing colder in earnest, frost silvering the grass by morning, and they wrapped themselves in the horse blanket and took their turns like sentries guarding something neither of them could yet name with confidence, only feel the shape of, the way one feels the shape of a coming storm before it breaks. By the fourth batch, she began setting some of the liquor aside in an old crock, unboiled, to see how it held on its own, unreduced, while he kept faith with the kettle and its slow, steady thickening. Comparing the two side by side in the gray hour before dawn, she found the boiled liquor darker, richer, almost syrupy where it pooled, while the raw liquor stayed thin and pale by comparison, more water than cure. It confirmed what she'd suspected from her hospital days, that the fire did more than concentrate the bitterness. It changed something in the substance itself, coaxed out a strength the raw soaking alone could not manage. Josiah, watching her turn the crock in the weak light, asked what she meant to do with knowing that. She said only that they would need consistency before they had a cure worth naming, that miners with bleeding gums wouldn't care for guesswork. They'd want the same relief in every bottle, every time. He nodded slowly, understanding the seriousness beneath her caution, and went to feed the fire again, adding another split length of alder from the woodpile, watching the flames climb steady around the kettle's black belly. Above the rack, the frost had begun creeping earlier each evening, dusting the leaves silver by the time the moon rose, and somewhere downstream the creek murmured on, still browner than either of them liked, still carrying more bark than trout. But in the crock and kettle both, something patient was taking shape. Not yet a remedy, not yet proven, only a promise thickening slow in the dark, waiting for morning to tell them what it had become. Morning came gray and close, the kind of light that made no promises either way, and she was at the crock before the coffee had finished its first rolling boil. She worked by feel as much as sight, dipping a clean sliver of ash wood into the liquor and drawing it out to watch how it clung, how long a bead held before it let go and ran. The first batch, boiled hard and long, sheeted off the wood almost too quick, thin as creek water dressed up dark. The second, drawn earlier from the fire the night before, hung heavier, slower, and she nodded at that one the way a person nods at a face they've decided to trust. He came up from the barn with the milk pail swinging loose in his hand and found her lining 3 jars in the window light, comparing them the way he'd once seen an assayer line up ore samples, tilting each toward the glass to catch what the sun offered. She didn't look up right away. When she did, she said the trouble wasn't making it strong. Strength came easy enough if a body boiled long enough and didn't mind losing half a day to smoke and worry. The trouble was making it the same. A batch too thin wouldn't touch a man's bleeding gums. A batch too thick might scorch the mouth it meant to heal, and a scorched mouth would send men back to their own remedies, whatever foolishness those were. He asked, careful, how a person measured such a thing without scales built for it, and she admitted she didn't rightly know yet. Only that in the hospital wards she'd watched an old surgeon judge tincture strength by how long it clouded a spoon of vinegar, and perhaps something like that could serve here, though the surgeon had never dealt in bark nor creek water, nor a homestead kettle blackened with 3 winters of use. It was thin ground to stand on, she said, but thin ground was better than none. So they spent the better part of that day testing what they had, dosing spoonfuls of vinegar from the pantry shelf, watching how the liquor swirled and settled, marking down in the back pages of her nursing ledger which crock had come from which soaking, which fire, which hour of boil. The numbers meant little to him at first, columns of minutes and temperatures scratched in her neat hand, but he saw the shape of what she was building, not a guess anymore, but a method, something a man could follow twice and get the same answer both times. Outside, the frost held later into the morning now, silvering the fence rail past 9 o'clock, and the creek's voice had changed with the season, gone thinner and quicker over the stones, though the brown still rode along its edges like a stain that hadn't decided to leave. She capped the strongest jar, set it apart from the rest, and told him this was the one worth carrying to Wallace. Not to sell yet, only to ask, only to learn if the doctor there knew enough to tell them if they'd made something true, or only something dark and bitter and useless. He wrapped the jar in a strip of wool blanket and set it in the bottom of the wagon box the evening before, tucking straw around it the way she once packed eggs for market, though what rode inside now was worth more to them than any crate of eggs had ever been. Neither of them spoke much of what they hoped the doctor might say. It seemed a fragile thing to put into words, as if naming the hope too plainly might scare it off before morning. The road to Wallace ran along the ridge above the creek before dropping down toward the wider valley, and from that height they could look back at the claim and see how small their season's work appeared against the timber, the boom logs a thin dark line, the leaching rack a scatter of pale boards, the cabin roof barely a patch among the firs. It struck her, riding beside him with the jar wedged between her boots, How much had changed in that narrow space since the leaves first turned, and how little of it would show to a stranger's eye. They left before light, the team's breath smoking in the cold, frost thick enough on the wagon seat that Josiah wiped it away with his glove before she climbed up. The creak noise fell behind them by the second mile, replaced by the ordinary sounds of the road: harness creak, the wagon's dry complaint on frozen ruts, a jay somewhere scolding the morning. Hattie kept her hand near the wrapped jar the whole way, not from any real fear of it breaking, but because it felt, she told him later, like something that wanted watching, the way a good hen wants watching near a hatching egg. Wallace showed itself the way it always did, smoke rising first, then the roof lines, then the noise of the place. Freight wagons, a hammer somewhere, men's voices carrying flat in the cold air. The doctor's office sat above the assay shop, up a narrow stair that Josiah had climbed twice before on lesser errands, but never with anything he half believed might matter. The doctor was older than Hattie remembered from her hospital years, spectacles low on his nose, sleeves rolled though the room was cold, a stove ticking in the corner with more smoke than heat. He looked at the jar a long moment before he took it, turning it once in the light from the window, studying the color the way a man studies weather. "Where did this come from?" he asked. Not as a challenge, but as a man asking a simple question he expected a simple answer to. Hattie told him, the bark, the boom, the rack, the numbers in her ledger. He listened without interrupting, uncorked the jar, touched a finger to the liquor, tasted it with the caution of a man who had swallowed worse in his years, but wasn't fool enough to trust anything untested. He said nothing for a moment. Then he reached for his own ledger, opened it to a blank page, and asked her to tell him everything again, slower, so he could write it down himself. The pen scratched slow across the page, and she matched her words to its pace, the way she once matched her breath to a patient's when the fever ran high and every word had to count. She told him the soaking times, the strength of the liquor by the darkness of it, how a wound answered different than a mouth of bad gums, how she had learned to thin the extract for drinking and leave it thick for dressing. He nodded at each answer as though checking it against something already written in his own memory, some older text learned in a colder city, and found her words did not quarrel with it. When she finished, he closed the ledger but did not set it aside. He looked instead at the man beside her, at the coat still damp at the shoulders from the walk up from the wagon, and asked how much bark stood behind such a jar. Josiah answered plainly, "Bark enough for 100 jars if the boom held, more if the camp above ever tired of burning what fouled their own water." The doctor's mouth moved, not quite a smile, more the shape a man makes when arithmetic turns out kinder than he expected. He told them of the camps up past Wallace, men living through the winter on salt meat and hard bread, with no green thing between them and the snow, gums gone soft and bleeding, teeth loosening in jaws too tired to complain. He told them of the diphtheria that had come through a mining camp 2 winters past, how he had stood over children too weak to swallow and wished for anything at all that might tighten a throat gone raw. He did not say the bark liquor would have saved them, he was too careful a man for that, but he said it might have helped, and that a man in his position learned to be glad of anything that might. He asked for 6 jars to start, to be given quiet, to men he trusted to report honestly, not out of parlor courtesy, but of plain interest. A bottle to a foreman with a cough that would not break. A bottle to a woman nursing her husband's split hands. A bottle to old miners whose gums had gone the color of raw meat. He would watch. He would write down what he saw. Then he would know what to ask for. Hattie said she would bring 6 by week's end, and thought of the kettle still needing its next long boil, the rack half loaded with bark, gone soft in the last soaking. Josiah said nothing, only turned the empty jar once in his hand before setting it back on the counter, as if weighing what it might yet hold. The doctor walked them to the stair, said little more, but at the last step he turned back and said he would want to know, come spring, whether the creek that gave such medicine could give it twice over. The question rode home with them through the first hard frost, settled somewhere between the wagon boards and the creaking harness, and it did not leave. Twice over. She turned the words in her mind the way he had turned the empty jar, weighing what they might yet hold. The bark rack told her the answer before her thinking did. What had once seemed a generous supply, the drifts caught by the boom, the soaked stacks steaming faintly in the cold mornings, now looked thin measured against 6 jars a week, and 6 jars was only where the doctor meant to start. She stood at the rack one gray afternoon, counting the soaked bundles twice, as if counting might change their number, and found instead that the creek had already told her the truth of it. The boom caught what drifted down. It did not command what the camp chose to send. She walked up along the frozen bank until the lumber camp's clearing opened before her, the great pale stacks of peeled trunks stark against the snow, and beyond them the mounded refuse of bark thrown aside in the peeling, more in that one heap, she judged, than the boom had caught in a month of drifting. That evening she told Josiah what she had seen, and he was quiet a long while over his supper, the way he grew quiet when a thing wanted careful handling. He said the camp foreman had never asked payment for what washed downstream, likely glad to be rid of it, and a man rid of trouble for nothing might be gladder still to be paid for the same trouble if the asking were done plain and without complaint. They went together the following morning, the two of them standing at the edge of the camp's clearing while sawdust drifted down like slow snow, and Josiah spoke to the foreman with the same steady patience he brought to mending fence. Not pleading, only laying the matter out. The bark was ruin to him and cure to them, and he would take it off the ground rather than let it wash where it pleased. The foreman looked at them a long moment, then at the heap, then back, and allowed there might be sense in a man hauling away his own trouble for a fair price, provided it did not slow the mill. It was not a yes so full as a door left standing open, but Hattie felt the cold air through it all the way back down the frozen bank, and did not yet let herself hope past it. The door left open did not swing wide all at once. It took the better part of a week, and in that week the creek taught them patience, the way it had taught them everything else, slowly, and by way of the hands. The foreman sent no word, only a boy with a mule and a note scrawled in pencil, asking how much bark a homestead could take before its kettles ran dry. She answered on the back of the same paper, in her plain schoolteacher hand, setting down a number she and her husband had worked out over the fire the night before, not so much as to seem greedy, not so little as to seem unserious. The mule went back up the frozen road, and for 2 days nothing came down it at all, and the silence sat on the cabin heavier than the snow on the roof. Then the wagon came. Not the boy this time, but 2 men and a jangling harness, and behind them a load of bark stacked higher than either of them, peeled clean and dry, the kind that had once simply been shoveled into the water because water was easier than a road. They tipped it at the leaching rack without being told twice where to put it, as if the camp had already decided the arrangement was settled and only wanted the Lunds to catch up to the decision. Josiah stood counting boards in his head, the way he counted rows of corn, working out how many more racks the claim could bear before the creek itself complained of crowding. Hattie stood counting bottles, the way she once counted doses in the mining hospital, working out how many jars they would need before the doctor's spring order came due. Between the 2 counts, there was a comfort neither said aloud, that the ruin now had a shape they could measure, and a debt now flowed the opposite direction it once had. That evening the foreman himself rode down, stiff in the saddle with the cold, and paid them in coin counted twice into Hattie's palm, as if a woman's hand made the sum more binding than a man's. He said little beyond the business of it, but before he turned his horse he looked once at the creek, quieter now beneath its skin of ice, and said it ran cleaner than he remembered it running in a long while. Josiah only nodded, but Hattie caught the look that passed between the two men. Not friendship yet, but something loosening where there had been only grievance. They stood at the rack until the wagon tracks faded into dusk, snow beginning again, soft and unhurried, settling over bark and boom and roof alike, as though the whole creek were being tucked in for the last hard stretch before spring. The deep cold held through January, and with it came the season's hardest test. Word rode down from the upper camp on a Tuesday morning, carried by a boy on a mule whose breath froze white with every word he spoke. 3 men down with sore throats gone bad, a gray film across the tongue that the camp cook had seen before, once, in a coastal town, and had hoped never to see again: diphtheria. The word alone was enough to empty half the bunkhouses of men who scattered to the far corners of camp, as if distance itself were medicine. She did not scatter. She had seen it in the mining hospital, had lost a child there once to it, before she ever wore a wedding band, and she remembered what the older nurses had done: the swabbing, the steam, the throat washes brewed strong and bitter from bark liquor cut with a little vinegar and warm water. She wrote out the mixture twice, once for the boy to carry back, and once for her own ledger, her hand steadier than she felt. He harnessed the sled before she had finished writing. They loaded what jars stood ready, wrapped in wool and straw against the cold, and set out before the light was full, the runners hissing over crusted snow, while the creek beside them lay dark and silent under its ice. Neither spoke much on the ride. There was a kind of prayer in silence that neither wanted to break with lesser words. At the camp they found the sick men set apart in a cook tent turned sick room, lantern lit against the gray morning, and she went to them without hesitation, the way she must have gone to men years before in another cold place. She showed the cook how to swab the throats, how to steam the tent with bark liquor boiling in a kettle over the stove, until the air itself turned medicinal and sharp. He stayed outside splitting wood for the fires that would need to burn all night, glancing in now and then to see her steady hands, her low voice, the fear in the room bending slowly under her calm. By evening one of the men could swallow water without wincing. It was not victory yet, only a loosening, the same loosening she had seen in the foreman's face weeks before. She came out into the cold at last and stood beside him without a word, watching her own breath rise into the dark, the creek somewhere below them still holding its long winter quiet, waiting, as they were, for whatever the next days would bring. The days after held their breath the way the creek did before a thaw. Word came from the cook tent each morning. First, that the fever broke in one man, then another, then that the whole tent of throats had opened enough to take broth. By the week's end, the doctor rode up from Wallace himself, snow to his horse's knees, and stood in the tent doorway a long while before he said what she had already guessed: that the bark liquor had likely been the difference between a graveyard and a room full of tired, mending men. He asked, before he left, that they double what they sent him by spring, and this time he did not haggle over the price. Winter loosened its grip slowly, the way old griefs do, not all at once, but in a softening no one could quite name until it had already happened. The icicles along the leaching rack began to weep in the afternoons. The boom logs, black and swollen all season, showed pale wood where the ice had scoured them. He walked the bank in March with an axe over his shoulder, more from habit than need, and found the creek already working at its own healing, carrying off the last dark sheets of ice in pieces no bigger than a barn door. By the time the alder buds broke, the pools below the boom ran the color of true water again, not the brown ruin of the autumn before, but a clear, cold amber that let the gravel show through. He crouched at the bank one warm noon and saw, for the first time in nearly a year, the quick shadow of a trout slide beneath a stone. He called her down from the cabin, and she came with flowers still on her hands, and they stood together at the water's edge like two people meeting a stranger they had once known well. The camp foreman rode down that same week with a wagon and a fair offer, to pay them for every load of bark hauled off before it ever reached the creek, so that the water need not be fouled again to be saved again. They took to sitting some evenings on the old boom logs, worn smooth now by a winter of ice and work, watching the light lay long and gold across the riffles. The rack still stood on the bank, mended and waiting for the next season's bark. The bottles still lined the shelf with her plain handwriting curling across each label. But it was the water itself that held them there longest, clear, moving, and alive again, the way it had been before either ruin or rescue, the way it would go on being now, because two people had refused to let a wound become a grave.